Hi, I'm Desiree Chappell. Welcome to Top Med Talk. It's Tuesday and it's time for my Roundtable. The Roundtable is a chance to sit down with a multidisciplinary group to have discussion about perioperative care and improving the quality of what we do every day.
Top Med Talk.
All right, well, hello and welcome to Top Med Talk. I'm Desiree Chappell, host and managing editor of Top Med Talk, and I'm joined by editor-in-chief Monty Mythen. Hello, Monty.
Great to be here, Desiree. And do you know one of the reasons why it's great to be here? One of the highlights is coming up. An old friend, he's not old in age, but been a friend for a long time. Professor Andy Shaw.
That's right.
Who's now fled to Canada, I think.
Well, let's ask him, Andy.
Yes, I am. I do currently work in Canada, that's right. Currently I work in the University of Alberta at the Mazankowski Alberta Heart Institute, where I'm the department chair and the clinical zone department head. So that's where I am now.
Mini geographical history. Quick.
So I hope everybody can hear I'm British. I trained in the UK at Barts and then at the Hammersmith. Did fellowships at the Brompton and Harefield and went to the States in 99. 6 years in Houston, 10 years at Duke, 5 years at Vanderbilt, and now I've moved to Alberta.
Well, we're lucky to have Joff Lacey with us as well. He's an anchor for Top Med Talk. Joff, thank you so much
great to be here.
For joining us. So, Andy, we wanted to sit down with you before your lecture today. You're going to be talking about fluids in the 2020's, which is kind of weird to say, honestly.
Yeah, it's going to be more a review of how we got here, actually. Yeah. And, I'm aware a lot of the people who come to this meeting come every year.
Yeah.
I've probably heard a lot of this as it's evolved over the last, 10, 15 years, really. So I'm going to try and summarize that and at the end ask a few questions about, where do we need to go. I've got a few slides about the great man himself as well, because obviously it's good to...
Ernest Henry.
Ernest Henry, exactly. Yeah. It's good to talk about that too.
So, Andy, we wanted to sit with you not only to talk about kind of the fluid portion of that, we'll hear more from the stage, but yesterday, actually, at the TriPOM sessions, there was a free paper, and there was a winner of those sessions, and that was actually for Anne Gregory.
That's right.
And all your guys' work at the University of Alberta. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Anne is a CVICU fellow. This was her fellow project, or one of them. And in a nutshell, it asks the question, what is the impact of intraoperative hypotension on postoperative outcomes? We heard in the last session a lot of the concerning data, if you will, a lot of the herald data, if you will, comes from a single institution. So no one ever believes controlled trial data from a single centre. They want to see multi-centre data. So in a sense, this is a project that takes those findings that the Cleveland Clinic guys have reported and extends that across hundreds of hospitals across the whole of North America. And the central premise is there a level of hypotension that occurs in the operating room that is associated with significant patient-centered clinical outcomes? And as I think anybody who came to Anne's session yesterday saw, yes, there clearly is. Hundreds of thousands of patients. This was a development validation design, which is important. So we split the data set up into 4/5 development and test the model that predicts the association in the patients that haven't seen that model, and validated very well. It's risk adjusted. And we find that there isn't really a safe level of blood pressure below a map of 75. Everyone accepts 65, and it's probably different for different outcomes, but there's a very clear association between dose, if you will, of hypotension, or the time-weighted average map below which the patient sits, 75, 65, 55. And the lower you are, for the longer you're low, the worse the outcome appears to be.
May I ask, were you able to get a kind of critical time that harm is then caused? I.e., is it as short as 1 minute that Dan Sessler pointed out, or was there...
Good question. We didn't look specifically for a threshold value for a specific period of time, but it turns out that the relationship is as you'd expect, continuous.
Yeah.
And because of the interval of the monitoring is typically about 5 minutes, because this is a non-continuous monitored data set, it turns out that there isn't really a specific level. Any blood pressure below, I think one of her highlight slides was any blood pressure below 75, the risk starts to increase. And the lower it goes for the longer time, the worse it is. And it's consistent across mortality, AMI, AKI, dialysis, readmission. The one outcome which was not statistically significant was stroke, but if you look very carefully at the forest plot, you'll see there is a trend. It's just that the event rate, mercifully, is so low that even with tens of thousands of patients, it's not powered to find a significant association.
Andy, I think Man's presentation, this is one of those data sets that depends on billing data as a surrogate for outcomes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. You're right. These are administrative outcomes. The good thing is things like stroke, MI, death, readmission are very expensive and therefore are reasonably well captured in billing or administrative data sets because people like to issue bills for expensive things.
And from what I saw, even if there was an error in that methodology, it would have to be a much bigger error than is thought to occur in by using billing surrogates.
The odds ratios are all within credible limits. The confidence intervals are tight. You could argue that that's just because the N is so high. We were discussing yesterday about, if you're predicting something rare that's not to happen, all you've got to do is say it won't happen a lot. We're relatively protected by that because the incidence of the outcomes is so common. 25% of people become hypotensive. And we think that's we've been overlooking that for too long. Tim Miller made a good point earlier on. Someone said, how come we're only finding this out now? And of course the answer is only in the last 10 years have we had data sets which are reliably captured from the EMR.
Yeah.
And we were discussing in the pokey session earlier on that when we look at those 4 papers, it's the post-operative blood pressure, which we know relatively little about, that where we do have information, there seems to be an even stronger signal of harm. Have you looked at that yet? And if you have, you're allowed to tell us what you found.
Yes, so the answer is yes, and I'll give you a sneak preview. Obviously, one of the problems is if you've been hypotensive in the OR already, that you carry that risk forwards with you. So you can't just say, let's extend the window and look at the whole perioperative period. So to avoid that, what we did was we took anybody who was hypotensive in the OR with an arbitrary definition of 65 millimeters of mercury, I think for 5 minutes or so, and excluded all of those patients. So we start anew with a new data set of everybody who makes it to the recovery room who has not been hypotensive so far. And it's not everybody, but it's a surprisingly robust number. And then we said, now if you become hypotensive, is there a hazard? And it turns out there is. And it turns out that the odds ratios are almost exactly the same as they are in the operating room. What we're doing now, and Anne did not show any of that, what we're doing now is to say, is there an incremental hazard of being hypotensive in the operating room and again in the operating room, and what is the incremental hazard of those two exposures? So the answer is yes and yes.
Is there a period of hypotension in the operating room that should now mean that you should be badged as high risk and therefore are not safe to go back to the floor?
You mean going into recovery? So the handover is this patient has been hypotensive for X minutes. Yeah. That gives her a 20% increased risk of X, Y, and Z. And and we need to do the following. Those are excellent questions. I guess the answer is yes. But remember, this is observational data. It's not causative. It's a bit of a stretch to suggest that there's something else that's happening in these hundreds of thousands of patients in all of these hospitals that's not the hypotension. But from a purist perspective, we ought to confirm, these data with interventional trials. I do like your idea of stressing the recovery room, the PACU, as a way of forcing people to pay attention. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, the handoff.
But has this data already started at your own institution changing the way you're managing patients, particularly the intraoperative hemodynamics?
No, this is brand new for us, literally off the press. The manuscript is still in Word format on my computer, so the answer's not yet. But Alberta's pretty good at rolling out system-wide interventions. We have a single province-wide health system, so I would hope we'd be able to do something about it fairly soon.
Fantastic.
We should let Andy go shortly because he's actually got to prep for his plenary lecture.
I know, and you need to...
One paper I just wanted to draw attention to, Andy. Within the last couple of years, you published a paper about our good old friend, the pulmonary artery catheter.
Yes, indeed.
And thumbnail sketch of what that showed?
So the thumbnail sketch is if you're having a heart operation in the data set that we looked at, if you're managed with a PA catheter, you're going to have a lower mortality and a lower readmission rate. Why is that? 'Cause everybody loves to bash the swan. Everybody says, oh, that's old history. I think it's because of the increase in right ventricular failure, right heart disease. The pulmonary artery catheter certainly allows you to manage the right side of the heart differently. And I think it's time to forget about swan versus insert your favourite monitoring instrument here and start thinking about co-monitoring of the left and right-sided circulations. Because we have medicines that affect both sides differentially. And I think the incidence of what we used to call core pulmonary or right-sided heart disease as a result of lung disease is much, much higher now than it was 20, 25 years ago. Swans are cheap. They're just not used very often, and I think that's a problem.
Very well.
I like to ask awkward questions that that tackle or question conventional wisdom, and that's just an example of that.
There's all that potential bias is the people who kept using the swan might just be the more interested applied human physiologists and pay a lot more attention.
Well, I think that's a fair criticism.
Yeah.
We do know that places that use a lot of PA catheters use them well, typically. Yeah. Places that use them infrequently run into trouble. I think that's the last orders bell, isn't it?
For whom the bell tolls.
I mean, not the last orders bell. Sorry, that must be the call to.
That's your bell. Call to action.
Exactly, the call to action.
Well, Andy, thanks again so much for sitting
welcome.
down.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Andy.
All right,
great work.
Cheers.
See you next time.
Thanks.
Top Med Talk.
Nate Majerison here. Thanks for listening to Top Med Talk. Now, before we let you go, it's important that we remind you to subscribe to Top Med Talk. That way you'll never, ever miss another episode. Also, if we could encourage you to join us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, pretty much every single social media platform, we're there. Join us. And finally, check out topmedtalk.com. If you go to our website, you can subscribe to email updates. That way we can always tell you where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing, and how you can join us. topmedtalk.com and click on the section marked email updates. Finally, Top Med Talk is proud to act as the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about them as well. ebpom.org is their website. That's ebpom.org. And if you go to ebpom.org/meetings, you can find out about some of the wonderful meetings that we attend and cover across the year here on Top Med Talk. That's ebpom.org/meetings.